The first time I noticed people disrespecting my husband, I told myself I was imagining it. It happened in a restaurant just outside Boston. The hostess smiled warmly at me, glanced at Daniel, then asked if we were waiting for the rest of the party. I remember feeling this small wave of embarrassment I couldn't explain. Not because of anything Daniel did. Because of how quickly people decided who he was. And what bothered me most was realizing, part of me was starting to do it too. When I met Daniel, he felt different from anyone I'd dated before. Calm. Not confident in the loud, polished way people usually admire. He was quieter than that. Like someone who had already stopped needing approval from strangers years ago. At first, I found it comforting. Later, I started finding it confusing. I worked for a branding agency where image mattered more than anyone admitted. Every conversation somehow became a quiet competition. Salaries. Apartments. Connections. Lifestyle. Even kindness sometimes felt performative. Daniel never participated in any of it. He wore plain clothes. Used an old laptop with stickers peeling off the corners. Drove a 10-year-old truck that made an ugly clicking sound every winter morning. And somehow, none of it seemed to bother him. That was the strange part. Most people who live simply either apologize for it, or secretly wish they could impress people more. Daniel did neither. He just lived that way comfortably. At first I admired that. But over time, after enough comments from coworkers and friends, tiny doubts started forming in places I didn't want to examine too closely. One night after dinner with my coworkers, my friend Erica asked me something while we waited for the valet. "So what's Daniel's long-term plan?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" She hesitated carefully. "I don't know, career-wise." I remember instantly becoming defensive. "He works in consulting." "Right," she said slowly. "But like, what kind?" I gave the same vague answer I always gave because honestly, I never fully understood what Daniel actually did. He traveled occasionally. Took strange calls at odd hours. Worked from home sometimes. Disappeared from meetings without explaining much. But whenever I asked, he answered simply. Operations. Advising. Logistics. The conversations always ended there. And weirdly, I stopped pushing further. Part of me assumed there just wasn't much to explain. That assumption stayed quietly in our marriage longer than I'd like to admit. A few months later, my agency hosted a networking event for investors and executives downtown. Spouses were invited. I almost told Daniel not to come. Not because I didn't want him there. Because I already knew what would happen. The room would fill with polished people wearing expensive confidence. Men discussing markets. Women discussing travel. Everyone subtly evaluating everyone else. And Daniel would stand out immediately. When I told him about the event, he smiled lightly. "You want me there?" "Of course." "Then I'm there." Simple as that. The night of the event, I spent almost an hour getting ready. Daniel wore the same dark navy suit he'd owned for years. I remember staring at his shoes while we stood near the door. They were clean. But visibly worn. For a brief second, I almost asked if he had another pair. The thought made me feel terrible instantly. But I couldn't deny it happened. That's the uncomfortable truth about social pressure. Sometimes it changes you quietly before you even notice. At the event, things unfolded exactly how I expected. People greeted Daniel politely, then lost interest within seconds. Some didn't even try hiding it. I watched conversations physically shift away from him. Meanwhile, men with louder personalities and more expensive watches somehow became magnetic. At one point, I found Daniel near the back terrace talking to one of the bartenders about motorcycles. He seemed completely relaxed, which honestly irritated me a little. I walked over and asked quietly, "You okay?" He smiled. "Why wouldn't I be?" I looked around carefully. "You don't feel uncomfortable? Should I?" His answer stayed with me longer than I expected. Because the honest truth was, I was the uncomfortable one. Not him. Me. I was worried about perception. Daniel didn't seem controlled by it at all. Later that evening, something happened I couldn't stop thinking about afterward. One of the senior executives at my company approached us with his wife. The man barely acknowledged Daniel before steering the conversation toward me. After a few minutes, his wife asked Daniel, "So what exactly do you do?" "Consulting," Daniel answered. "Oh," she replied with a polite smile that ended almost immediately. Then she turned back toward me. It was subtle, but brutal. Like his existence had been professionally categorized and quietly dismissed. I glanced at Daniel expecting annoyance. Instead, he calmly sipped his drink like nothing happened. On the drive home, I finally asked him, "Why do you let people treat you like that?" Daniel looked genuinely confused. "Like what?" "Like you're insignificant." He was quiet for a few seconds. Then he asked something I didn't expect. "Do you think I am?" The question hit harder than it should have. Because I didn't know how to answer immediately. Not because I believed he was insignificant, but because I realized I'd started unconsciously measuring him using other people's standards. Income, status, presentation, signals. And somewhere along the way, I'd confused those things with value. "I don't know," I admitted quietly. Daniel nodded slowly like he appreciated the honesty. Then he looked out the windshield and said something I would think about for years afterward. "Most people aren't reacting to reality," he said. "They're reacting to symbols." At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. A few weeks later, I came home early from work and heard Daniel speaking in his office upstairs. His tone sounded different. More direct. More authoritative. "No," he said firmly. "Pause the acquisition until Tokyo signs off. I want the numbers reviewed again before Monday." I stopped outside the door. Acquisition? Tokyo? For a second, I honestly wondered if I'd misunderstood the conversation. Then he opened the door and saw me standing there. His expression softened immediately. "Hey," he said casually. I tried laughing it off. That sounded intense. "Just work." Again, simple. Too simple. That night, for the first time in our entire relationship, curiosity started turning into suspicion. Not betrayal. Just confusion. Because pieces weren't fitting together anymore. Over the following days, I started noticing things I'd ignored before. Calls from international numbers. Emails from major corporations. People addressing him differently on the phone than they did in person. And once, very late at night, I walked into the kitchen and saw Daniel staring silently at financial reports spread across the table. Not casually reading them. Analyzing them. When he noticed me, he calmly closed the folder. And suddenly I realized something strange. My husband had spent years seeing people clearly, while almost nobody truly saw him. Including me. The real turning point came 3 months later. My company was invited to a private fundraising dinner attended by investors, founders, and executives from several major firms. It was one of those events where everyone acted slightly more important than usual. The atmosphere felt rehearsed. Carefully curated conversations. Carefully curated personalities. Even laughter sounded strategic. Daniel almost skipped it. But eventually he agreed because he knew the event mattered to my career. That night, the same pattern repeated again. People dismissed him almost instantly. One man looked at Daniel's truck key sitting on the table and asked jokingly, "You valet that thing yourself?" A few people laughed politely. Daniel smiled. "That bad, huh?" The man grinned. "Depends how emotionally attached you are to it." More laughter. I remember feeling this deep secondhand discomfort in my chest. Not because the joke was devastating. Because it revealed something ugly about the room. People become careless when they think someone has lower status. That's when they reveal themselves most honestly. About an hour later, the energy in the ballroom suddenly changed. Conversations slowed. Several executives straightened immediately. A group of internationally known investors had just entered the event. Even I recognized two of them from magazine covers. But what happened next made the entire room go quiet. One of the investors saw Daniel. And immediately walked straight toward him. Not casually. Purposefully. "Daniel," he said warmly, shaking his hand with both hands. "You disappeared after Geneva." "Geneva?" I stared at my husband, completely frozen. Another executive joined them. "Your recommendations saved us nearly 300 million last year," he said. "I still owe you dinner." The room around us became painfully silent. People were listening now. Really listening. Then one of the senior board members at my agency walked over looking genuinely stunned. He looked directly at Daniel. "You're Daniel Mercer?" Daniel gave a small uncomfortable smile. The man blinked slowly. "You own Mercer Holdings?" Everything inside me stopped for a second. Because even I knew that company. Everybody did. Not publicly flashy. But enormous. Private investments. Infrastructure. International acquisitions. The kind of company powerful people spoke about carefully. And suddenly every confusing moment from the past few years rearranged itself in my mind. The calls. The meetings. The travel. The complete indifference toward impressing people. He wasn't pretending to be ordinary. He simply didn't organize his identity around wealth. Meanwhile, everyone else did. Including me. Within minutes, the room transformed. The same people who ignored Daniel earlier suddenly leaned toward him during conversations. People laughed harder at his jokes. Asked for his opinions. Tried introducing themselves again. And for the first time, I saw something clearly that made me deeply uncomfortable. Nothing about Daniel had changed. Only the information attached to him had changed. That was enough for everyone to suddenly see intelligence where they previously saw mediocrity. Value where they previously saw irrelevance. Human beings don't just judge appearances. We build entire personalities around them. Later that night, after the event ended, Daniel and I sat quietly inside his truck overlooking the river. Neither of us spoke for a while. Then I finally whispered, "Why hide it?" Daniel looked thoughtful for a moment. "I wasn't hiding," he said calmly. "I just stopped advertising." I stared out the windshield silently. He continued softly. "When people think you can't do anything for them, their behavior becomes honest." That sentence changed something in me permanently. Because I started replaying years of interactions in my head. The dismissive smiles. The shallow conversations. The subtle disrespect. The assumptions. And worst of all, my own. I had always believed I was more thoughtful than that. More aware. But social environments shape perception slowly. Quietly. Sometimes without permission. And the truth is, I hadn't fully respected Daniel's simplicity because I confused simplicity with lack of ambition. That realization hurt. Not dramatically. Just deeply. After people learned who Daniel was, everything changed around us. Co-workers suddenly described him as brilliant. Executives who ignored him now invited him to private dinners. People who barely acknowledged him suddenly treated him like he'd always mattered. But I couldn't stop noticing the psychology behind it anymore. The performance. The unconscious hierarchy. The way humans attach value to signals instead of character. And strangely, Daniel never seemed angry about any of it. One evening months later, I asked him why. He smiled slightly and said, "People are usually responding to their own fears more than other people." What does that mean? He shrugged softly. Most people spend their lives terrified of being seen as unimportant. So they chase symbols that protect them from that feeling. I remember sitting there quietly after he said that. Because suddenly the entire world started making more sense. Not just wealthy people. Everyone. The need to impress. The obsession with appearance. The constant comparison. Underneath most of it was fear. Fear of invisibility. Fear of judgment. Fear that without status, nobody would value us. But Daniel had somehow escaped that trap years earlier. And maybe that's why he always looked freer than everyone else in those rooms. Now, whenever I meet someone for the first time, I pay attention differently. Not to clothes. Not to confidence. Not to titles. I pay attention to how people treat others who seem unimportant. Because I've learned something I can never unlearn now. The clearest window into human psychology isn't how people treat the powerful. It's how they treat the person they believe has nothing to offer them.